He moved her body, went and buried the body, cleaned the scene. He was very methodical after the offence. There was a lot of cleanup, there was a lot of stages. Often when a partner is killed or an ex-partner is killed, it's where there's been a high level of coercive control and the victim has tried to regain a level of independence and autonomy, and they have killed that person as that sort of final act of trying to have dominance and control. We're seeing more and more young people now presenting with risk factors and concerning behaviours that if someone had said that to you a decade ago, you would have been horrified and you would have hit the panic button.
Welcome back to part 2 of my chat with forensic psychologist Nathan Brooks. In part 1, we talked about Nathan's work, the difference between serial killers and mass murderers, and the emerging trend of lone actors who go on killing sprees. In part 2, Nathan talks about the Christchurch massacre, where the actions of one man led to the death of 51 people. Nathan breaks down how and why this crime occurred, and how we can try and prevent these types of killings in the future. It was a fascinating and informative chat. Have a listen to what Nathan has to say. Nathan Brooks, or Dr. Nathan Brooks, I should say. Welcome back to part 2 of I Catch Killers.
Thanks, Gary.
I've got to say, I am finding this conversation fascinating. It was, working as a homicide detective, I found this inside the mind of killers or all the type of things that you're examining absolutely fascinating. I'm sure you're getting this all the time, but... Is that people are? Why are they so fascinated with it?
I think unpacking what makes troubling and sometimes very violent people tick it's fascinating because most of us can't understand it. And when we think about psychopaths, for instance, they are the ones that think different and make different decisions, and we're often caught up in our own emotions. But for some folks, like psychopathic folks, they're cool and calm under pressure. They're not burdened by the anxiety that we have, and that's hard for everyday people to understand.
Yeah. I want to talk about the Christchurch massacre, which is, I'm sure most people know it. I'll just read out a summary of it, just so people that haven't been aware of it are aware of what happened. So, 2 consecutive mass shootings took place in Christchurch, New Zealand on the 15th of March 2019. They were committed during Friday prayer, first at the Al-Noora Mosque at Riccarton at 1:40 p.m. and almost immediately after at Linwood Islamic Centre at 1:52. Altogether, 51 people were killed and 89 others were injured, including 40 by gunfire. The perpetrator was an Australian man, Brenton Tarrant, then aged 28. Tarrant was arrested after his vehicle was rammed by a police car as he was driving to a third mosque in Ashburton. He live-streamed the first shooting on Facebook, making the first successful live-stream far-right terror attack, and had published a manifesto online before the attack. That just sort of sets the scene. I think anyone that recalls that incident knows how horrifying it was. You've looked at it in depth. What's your take on what caused the lead up to it and why did it get that dramatic? And we touched on small parts of it in part 1, if we could just deep dive into it now.
Yeah, so before we get into it, I might caveat that I'm obviously with the New Zealand Police, and this is certainly my view on the situation. It's not at all reflective of theirs, but it is a really complex case. I think when anyone carries out such a horrific mass act of violence, there are many, many layers, and what we saw in that incident and that tragic attack was that several years of build-up went into it. It wasn't something that just happened overnight. We know that Tarrant moved to New Zealand with the intention of carrying out a mass casualty attack, and that was his reason for moving over there. I believe he cited the fact that it was partly the ability to access the firearms. That was one of the primary factors. And shortly after getting there, he commenced training with firearms and acquiring tactical capabilities. But to understand him, we probably need to trace things back to his childhood. And he had in many ways probably something that hasn't garnered a lot of attention, quite a traumatic childhood. We've focused a lot, particularly I think the media coverage has been a lot around his ideology, but there are a lot of puzzle pieces that were there early on for him in his early years.
Yep. What type of things were they?
So one of the things that we look at for childhood is whether people experience trauma and the influence that can have on them as they develop and grow into adults. And adverse childhood experiences is often a marker that we use to look at how bad that trauma is, or how much adversity a child has had in their upbringing. And a lot of research would say around 4 or 5 adverse experiences can have quite significant impact on someone as they age and really shape who they become. And we know Tarrant had a troubled upbringing, so his parents separated, which I'll just run through some of the. So some of the adverse experiences are parental separation, parental mental health, criminality, unstable housing, financial issues, drug use. So the typical things that we might expect. Yeah. And so Tarrant's parents obviously split up, so he had the separation. His mother then started dating a new individual. I believe it was an Aboriginal fellow, and he was reportedly violent towards Tarrant and his sister, and that abuse continued over several years. Then we also had his father, who suffered from mental health difficulties, and then also developed cancer, I believe, for memory, and ultimately then committed suicide as well. So there was some quite notable things
Significant
there.
trauma.
Yeah, and he also, Tarrant himself, was struggled to fit in socially, as we've touched on before. He was often bullied. He was considered to be quite overweight as well. And then in his late teens, he had a big transformation and became quite fixated and obsessed about the gym and lost quite a lot of weight.
I think it was in your book. It was something like 40 or 50 kilos. So a huge.
Quite remarkable. And also during that adolescence, we see that some early racist remarks were coming out in his school years, which suggests there's certainly some difficulties with how he's seeing the world and people, and maybe even seeing that there's certain people that are to blame or that are causing hardships for him, and that might have been reflective of what things were like on the home front with with the physical abuse that was happening at home. And from there, as he aged, I think he has spent a period being a personal trainer after high school, and then he inherited a large sum of money once his father passed away, and that basically funded him to go and travel overseas for quite a few years. And unfortunately, rather than taking inspiration from the life and the cultures and the different people, he became very cynical. And if we look at the various accounts and things that have been covered on the topic, his views were shaped in a very negative manner. It did coincide with, while he was in Europe, with some Islamic-based attacks occurring, Islamic-based terrorist attacks at the time. And that all sort of seemed to come together along with his strong reliance on online groups in 4chan and 8chan and some of these other forums where he was really fueling his beliefs about the world and having those reciprocated back to him. And the classic sort of echo chamber effect started to happen from there, where the ideology really became perpetuated and it continued to get reinforced over time.
I suppose what he's exposing himself to is only going to people that share the same ideology, and that becomes that cycle.
Yes.
That reinforces his belief.
Yeah, and I think the further down that rabbit hole that you go, the more you find things that support those views. And, we get the classic distortion aspect happen where you look for things that are what you want. You look for things that reinforce your beliefs, and then you ignore anything that's contradictory. And that's what we find with a lot of ideological aspects is people cherry pick what they focus on, and they ignore the things that are contradictory to that. And that, of course, can very easily then start to lead to quite extreme beliefs when you're only looking at, a small fragment of an issue.
So the build-up, would you describe it as a perfect storm in terms of what the build-up before he carried out this horrible act?
Well, there's certainly, I think, the psychological makeup, the psychological foundation was a big factor. So he had a lot of vulnerabilities there, clearly a lot of unresolved anger that was never addressed. And then we add the internet piece on top of that, where he's engaging in various ideological extreme right-wing views that are being perpetuated and fueled. He's then quite financially well off as well, which gave him access and capability factors, and then develops the plan or the intent to carry out some sort of violence to avenge or seek justice for the injustice which he's perceiving in the world, and then starts to begin planning and moves to New Zealand with the intention of carrying out a mass casualty attack. And a bit like with Anders Breivik in Norway, we see the culmination of factors come together, along with the secrecy and the willingness to dedicate a couple of years of your life to carrying out such a horrific act of violence. I mean, that in itself is nearly unheard of, and so remarkable that someone could be so dedicated over
that obsession
to give their life to that.
Yeah. There were a number of inquiries that flowed on from the event. Did anything jump out in either a part where it could have been, I won't say prevented, because as I keep saying, it's easy in hindsight, but is there any indicators or ways that it could have been diffused, do you think? How could you approach it if you look back with the benefit of hindsight? Okay, when he got to this point, there should have been some intervention.
Yeah, that's, again, it's always
difficult.
tricky in hindsight. Yeah. So there was a Royal Commission in New Zealand Royal Commission of Inquiry into the attack, and it's nearly a 900-page document which reviewed it. Now, some of the interesting findings were more around systems and processes rather than Tarrant himself. So it looked at things. So he had a gunshot wound in the months prior to the attack, and at the time there were no mandatory reporting practices for gunshot wounds. Right. So that has since changed, so that if someone presents to hospital with a gunshot wound, that is then passed on to police and then followed up. Firearm register was something that wasn't strong, and that's then been completely revamped to make access to firearms much more difficult, and mental health checks and interviews and those sorts of processes. So again, another positive step that's been put in place. Yeah, and of course the access to guns has been reduced as well. So some of those capability and incident reporting systems have been improved. Been a lot more funding as well that's gone into violent extremism, and I think as well that the improved police practices, and that's not being critical at all of the police practices, but unfortunately when we have incidents it causes reviews
and leads to change and improvements of course when it gets that way. I suppose the magnitude of the crime that he created there required that review. Lesser type of crimes, but one you and I spoke off camera about it, and you're over here and you're going to deliver a lecture on it. Stalking. Stalking to me is a major concern. What message have you got, or what have you learnt about stalking, people that are prepared to stalk? And over here in Australia, and not just New South Wales, across the country, we've got a lot of domestic violence where, unfortunately, it's male partners invariably murdering female partners. And you look at it, and I can virtually guarantee there'll be stalking involved, and not accepting the relationship being over, and different things like that. What's your assessment of stalking?
Oh, look, it's so troubling, and one of the challenges with stalking is that it exists on such a spectrum, from small unwanted acts, repeated contact that's unwanted, all the way through to very predatory and concerning behaviours, such as breaking into a house and going through a person's underwear drawer and moving things around. So it is a type of offending that is so broad. But we need to think about it, I think, from a couple of different lenses. And one is, how persistent is it?
Yep.
And then also, how likely is it to become severe and escalate in nature? So stalking can be very broad in motivation. So sometimes it's targeted because of, resentment towards an ex-partner.
Yep.
Sometimes it's revenge towards a workplace. Other times it might be because the person's mentally unwell and they're constantly making unwanted contact because of quite a distortion about the person that they're targeting. And then other times it's very predatory, and that can often end up in quite significant violence or even sexual offending towards the person. So it's multifaceted and it exists on a spectrum.
Have you, in your work with New Zealand Police, been involved in stalking cases and how they've played out? You don't have to identify the specific case, but stalking cases that have escalated.
Yeah, look, as both a consultant, forensic psychologist, and also working in the police, and a lot of the times it's looking at it from a threat lens and how concerned do we need to be about the case. And sometimes it's about understanding the motivation and the functionality of the stalking. So what is it that the person's trying to achieve here, and why is it that they are failing to understand that behaviour is unwanted and not reciprocated? So often there's an educational component. Now, then sometimes it's looking at as well, is this going to persist or is this going to escalate with the stalking case? Intimate partner violence is another one that we sometimes become very concerned about. Often stalking will exist amongst a range of other forms of intimate partner violence, particularly coercive control. And we know that across cases of fatal intimate partner violence, that around about 75% of those cases have stalking in them. And often when a partner is killed or an ex-partner is killed, it's where there's been a high level of coercive control and the victim has tried to regain a level of independence and autonomy, and that has been the final tipping point for the offender, and they have killed that person as that sort of final act of trying to have dominance and control over their lives, which is really quite horrific.
Well, the scary part is the dangerous period is in those domestic violence situations when the partner is trying to leave. That's when they're at the greatest risk.
Absolutely, yeah. It is concerning, and again, education is quite important. But the flip side of that is it's hard to have that conversation with people as well. And should people really have to be that well educated and informed? Everyone has a right to safety in many ways, and unfortunately, we still have huge concerns with people willing to take matters into their own hands and become violent.
Do you think? And I'm talking New South Wales or Australia, maybe relevant to New Zealand, whether the courts fully appreciate the nature of it. If someone, even the public's perception, it's almost a joke, like, oh, I've got a stalker, and we sort of laugh.
Yeah.
But I've had so many people contact me when I was in the police as police work, but people contact me post-police reaching out, and they've got a stalker and no one seems to take it seriously, and they're terrified. Do you think the courts take it and the police take it seriously enough, stalking?
It's hard to give a blanket answer to that, but with what you're saying, there are, of course, many cases where people just go, oh, it's unwanted contact. They'll stop, or they just dismiss it. And that's where stalking becomes a problem, because when we dismiss it, it keeps going.
Yes. And
we need to make sure that we're putting the right level of response to a situation. Yeah. And the temptation is, unfortunately, to water down the seriousness of it. And that, of course, allows it to keep going. And then before you know it, it's 3 months, then it's 6 months, then we've hit a year, and that's a really reinforced and ingrained pattern. And the person may, or the offender may have had quite a bit of, feedback that this is a successful way to keep that person in their life by that stage.
Well, I think, and this is when I'm giving people advice, if they got a stalker, if they make contact and it does end up in court, their concern is that brings this person back into my life, and so the stalkers achieved what they wanted to achieve. So it's a hard thing to police, but it's something that I've always thought they were red flags to me when I saw it in any capacity of an investigation. If someone was stalking someone, being told, we don't want to speak to you, stay away from us, and they ignore that, that is a warning sign. Am I on the right track there? Like it's
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, you look at things like approach behaviour, how much are they prepared to, or to what extent are they prepared to approach the victim, to be intrusive towards the victim? Are they engaging in surveillance-like behaviours? Are they entering the person's residence? Yeah. And also factors such as mental illness can play a role, personality disorders, and we look at as well, are they deterred by things such as court orders? If it keeps going after court orders, again, that's very troubling.
Well, I've had people that the victims of the stalking that have come back to me when the courts haven't gone hard on the stalker comes back to them just laughing, going, look, the courts don't even care. And it empowers them. On coercive control, we've relatively recently had that start to come into play, legislation to come into play. I haven't seen it actually play out in court, so I think a big part of it is going to be how the police use it as a tool. I think it's a powerful tool. Is coercive control legislated over in New Zealand? Is that something that's come into play over there?
No, it's not legislated over there yet, and remarkably, we don't actually have a stalking law or a stalking charges yet. So there's been talk that, or I shouldn't say talk, it's probably a loose word for that, but there's been political movement that legislation is going to be proposed quite soon, and then we will have a stalking law. But no, coercive control over in Australia here is a reasonably new charge in a couple of states. So it'd be really interesting to monitor how that goes. But the research on intimate partner violence has certainly been the big reason that we're seeing that law come in, because it's been so prevalent but also relevant to fatal cases.
Yeah. There's been too many of them in this country, that's for sure. The interview room.
Yes.
You're working for New Zealand Police. Is that part of the role that you do? Help investigators prepare for an interview, to sit down in the interview room?
Yeah, we've been doing quite a bit of work in that space of late over the last 2 years or so, and it is one of the main things that we're doing currently around how do we understand the person in front of us, and how do we tailor our response to ensure that we're meeting them at their level.
Yeah. I find the interview room fascinating. That was my happy place in policing. I found it very stimulating to be in the interview room. A lot of pressure, a lot of build-up and all that, but the way that you approach an investigation. I'll throw a couple of things out just for point of discussion. I learnt from people that I looked up to as interviewers, and I've sort of tried to adopt aspects of the way they approach an interview. But I also learnt that you've got to be legitimate, like you've got to be yourself in the interview room. I've seen people I've tried to mimic people the way they interview someone. Doesn't work. I've got to be myself. I've had other people try to mimic me the way I interview. It doesn't work. So I think there's something you've got to build that rapport with someone in the interview room. Would you agree with that? Yeah,
spot on. I mean, rapport has become arguably the most crucial ingredient in an interview now, and we have come a long way. It's hard to talk about what current police practices are, but I dare say that across Australia and New Zealand, there's a improved understanding that rapport really is a cornerstone of the interview. So it's very hard to have a serious major crime interview without rapport. We can't just get the person in now and go straight into the offending, straight into the issues. There's got to be a build-up to that, because we can't expect someone to want to talk to us if we're not establishing rapport with them.
Yeah, I agree with that. And people have said characteristics of a good detective: empathy in the interview room, that I'm sitting down and trying to understand where this person's coming from. It might disgust me where they're coming from. I mightn't agree with it, but I won't show that on my face. It will be very much a poker face in what they're telling me, so there's not judgment there. To go at people, again, I'll just throw in some of my thoughts on the interview room because I'm interested in getting your thoughts. Some people, I'd go into the interview room and I would be very professional. I'd deliberately present professionally because I thought that was the best way to communicate. Otherwise, I'd get in there and be very relaxed. When we talk about rapport, that's the type of thing I'm assessing the person in the way that I want to approach. Sarah Yule, the forensic psychologist I work with, talk about the carrot or the stick, whether you're dangling something to them that they want, or they're feeling, and we can't threaten people in an interview room, obviously, stick figuratively. We don't go in there with a stick. What's your thoughts on different approaches for different offenders? Like, there's not a one model fits all, is there?
No, there's not. But I think there's some rules of thumb that do hold up really well with rapport. So, firstly, we need to foster commonalities. So, first principle is if you're going to interview someone, what is it about you that's going to allow you to relate to that person? What have you got in common? So everyone should be able to find those things. Secondly, we then look at our ability to compliment the person. And I think when we say compliments, people think, oh, what are you on about? You're just basically trying to praise them unnecessarily. But there's always things when we step back and look at someone's life that we can acknowledge and validate. And that is quite crucial that we still do that. We recognise them as individuals. And as small as that achievement may be, it may be significant for them. So where is there scope to compliment and validate that person? And then the other one is humour. And that probably sounds like it doesn't belong in an interview room, but how can we find moments of lightheartedness amongst a really heavy and serious conversation?
Yeah, I get where you're coming from, and that's very much creating that relaxed environment where the conversation will be flowing. I think the way I approach interviews, some people are very specific word orientated, listening to your answer, what exactly you said. I know that's what comes down because the transcripts only reflects what you said. But if I'm interviewing you in an interview room, in a tense interview, and this is one where it's not a lay down misère, you haven't got all the evidence. A lot's going to depend on what the person of interest that you're interviewing talks about. It's about creating that environment where they feel comfortable to talk. But I'm watching their body language. Like, I might throw something out a little bit left field, a little bit strange, see how you react. Which way do you lean to within interviewing, or is this coming down to what I said at the start, that it's individual styles?
I think it is individual styles, and some people naturally have a really good style and some can learn it.
Yep.
There's the intrusiveness piece to an interview as well. So when do you become intrusive about the content of that conversation? And when I say intrusiveness, what I'm really talking about is topics that are uncomfortable and maybe more confronting. So you would want to start low and soft and easier conversation topics in the early stages of the interview. And as the rapport develops, then you can become more intrusive because there's a level of trust and respect, understanding developed between the interviewer and the interviewee. So you can't go in too hot or too intrusive too early because you put yourself on the back foot and you risk upsetting the person. So I think with the peace model, which is widely used, really in some ways it's a bit like a 5-set tennis match where we're looking at the cumulative momentum over several hours and it's going back and forth. And if you do enough things the right way, it tips in your favour.
And a lot of the public's perception is that we've got the right to interview people too, as in you're obliged to answer questions. That's very much not the case.
No.
So they're well within their rights. I've also found, and talk to me about the characteristics of the people that would buy into this, that I've sat down with people that have an arrogance about them, and that's the very thing I'm going to exploit. That, like, they're dumb to sit down and have an interview with me, but they're so arrogant they think they're going to, outsmart. It doesn't have to be me. Outsmart the police. I'm smarter than you, and that's why they can't resist themselves sitting down and having an interview. Do you see that type of personality?
Yeah, there's the tendency of people that believe that they can control the situation, and that they can talk their way out of it, or they are the smartest person in the room, and that can sometimes bring them undone. A case over in New Zealand, which has been quite public, and there's been a Netflix documentary on it, is Jesse Kempson and the Grace Mullane case. And
tell us your assessment on that.
Yeah, there's been a lot published, and segments of the interview that have been publicly put out there of Kempson during his interview, and we certainly saw that, he started off very calm and believed that he could talk his way out of it during the first interview. That ended up bringing him undone during the second interview, where a lot of those stories were then able to be corroborated, and that worked against him in the end.
Yeah. But it is interesting what motivates people to sit down and participate in the interview. What about crime scenes? Your interpretation of crime scenes, and I think a discussion initially when you came in here before on camera, talking about psychopaths, how they can commit a horrendous crime and not be rattled by it and leave. I would see crime scenes where I would call it like a panic crime scene. I don't think the person planned this. It shocked them that they've killed a person, and the crime scene represents that. What's your take, and what can you learn from going to a crime scene?
Oh, crime scenes are so valuable from anyone in the operational spaces. You nearly need to see the crime scene, or at least have incredibly good photos of it to be able to form any conclusions around it. But look, you look for contradictions ultimately in the crime scene, don't you? And sometimes chaotic crime scenes are staged crime scenes as well. And then the absence of things at crime scenes can also be very telling. So it's what's not there that's important. And then the disarray as well can also be quite telling. So I know that FBI would say that you study the work of the artist, which is their crime scene, to try and understand them. But I think the crime scene gives us very good insights into, one, how the crime has occurred, and then why things may or may not be there that should be there, or have been removed from a scene. So it really looks at, 3 stages: before the crime, during the crime, and then after the crime, and that can give us valuable information across those 3, and then together you form, whether it's a profile or a working theory around the offender and how that occurred.
Break down an example, or give examples for those 3 breakdowns.
Well, so if we go back to the Jesse Kempson case, so it's been quite well publicised that he met Grace Mullane, and then they went out for dinner, and then they went back to his hotel room. Something transpired there, which resulted in Grace's death. It certainly seems like it was probably unlikely that there was any intention to kill her. But then when we look at post-crime, we see that he was very methodical after the offence, and there was a lot of cleanup. There was a lot of stages. It's been well documented around him. He moved her body, went and buried the body, cleaned the scene, and there was quite a calmness in the chaos at the time. And that's rather unusual. We think about someone trying to recover from a horrific event. There's a lot of anxiety and panic and concern. It's unusual to be quite methodical and calm.
Oh, very much so, and that was something I always look to exploit. That mistakes are made after that in the murder has occurred, or the crime has occurred. Little things like if a murder weapon has been introduced to the crime scene, if it's a murder's happened in the house and it's the kitchen knife from the kitchen bench that's been used as a murder weapon, that tells me it wasn't intent at the time. They're going there. Something escalated. Something has happened at the time. So not the planning. And these are the type of things you look for as a forensic psychologist.
Yeah, definitely. How prepared and planned was someone prior to the crime?
Yeah.
And again, going back to, is there evidence of cleanup? And have items been taken away from the scene?
Yeah.
Whether it's weapons or belongings of the victim, has the body been moved? If the body is there, is there quite a bit of forensic evidence that still remains? Often we think loosely as a rule of thumb, the less evidence that's at the scene and the more that has been removed. We're talking about a planned and prepared offender. Go back to the classic FBI organised, disorganised profile, which looked at the organised fellows tend to, come to the scene prepared and take things away and leave limited forensic evidence. The disorganised, often there's a lot of forensic evidence. Things are in disarray. There can be a scrambled attempt to cover the crime up and make it look like something else.
Well, I take a lot away from the way the bodies are disposed of too. And you can almost see the panic in the way some bodies are disposed of, or you can see the planning in the time. So that's all very telling, isn't it?
Yeah, so some of them are quite superficially disposed of. Essentially, it's the first opportunity, or they're buried very
basically get this body away from me.
Yeah, and then others are take much longer and much more time.
Yeah. Without going into methodology, is this the type of thing you sit down with police, New Zealand police? Like they'll come to you, there's been a crime, a body's been found, they contact you, and this is how you work with the police?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So it could be in a variety of stages. It could be the homicide's just happened and we're trying to understand the crime scene and the behaviour that's happened and insights into the offender. It could be that we're 4 weeks on and things have hit a wall and leads have run dry, and we'll review the crime and look at trying to generate new lines of inquiry.
Right. We spoke in part one about serial killers, or the demise of serial killers, which is a pretty good way of saying it. That's good if they're reducing that. Serial sex offenders, but I've worked serial sex crimes. Have they reduced like serial killings? The same things that are reducing serial murderers, reducing serial sex offenders, or is it still?
Yeah, the big one would be our intruder rapists, and it is rare for us to get a series of those these days. I think that's true across Australia and New Zealand. We would still get lots of touching-based offences towards strangers, bus stops, those sorts of public areas, but the rapist that's targeting strangers or going into homes it's much less common. That doesn't mean that they don't happen, those offences, but it's rare that they are a series now. They're often caught much quicker. And again, that's because of all the improvements in technology that we have.
And just the sharing of information too. I think that's a big part, because before we would often be looking for an offender that's got a certain type of characteristics about the way he commits a crime. Someone else in the neighbouring LAC might be doing the same thing. And in the old days, it wasn't a case that we'd be sharing the information, but we've woken up to that now.
And see, New Zealand runs VICLAS, which catalogues all the stranger sex offences across the country. So our behavioural science unit is keeping a data log of over a decade and more of all the stranger sex crimes. So if we do have something that comes up, we're able to draw on more than 8,000 to 9,000 cases and look at what we know about something of a similar nature with a similar type of offending pattern.
Right.
And of course, if we do get something, we could also look back at whether it is linked to any other crimes as well.
Okay. Again, excuse me from jumping from point to point, but I'm finding the whole chat very interesting. Mental health. What part does that play? And I've got some stats here that I pulled out of your book, so I'm hoping they're correct. That 17 and 50% of lone actors are suffering from a mental illness at the time of offending. 2/3 of perpetrators experiencing mental health concerns in the period leading up to their attack. So, look, regardless of the specifics of the stats, it's saying that mental health is a big thing in lone actors. What type of mental health issues are we looking at there?
Yeah, I mean, it's the catch-22, isn't it, in many ways of mental health, because, it's on a spectrum,
Yeah.
and it can be all the way from psychotic-based presentations where someone has completely lost touch with reality,
Yeah.
and they are unaware and they don't have sound mind with what they're doing, and it seems as though that is a good example of the Bondi Junction with attack with Joel Couchy, that he was schizophrenic for a long period of time and psychotic at the time.
Yeah, how much do you know about that particular case?
Well, I think it's still emerging. I know there was the recent inquiry and
Yeah.
the results haven't been published, but
Yeah.
the psychotic aspect and his long-term schizophrenic diagnosis seems to be quite central.
And I think it's already been mentioned in the public and would have been mentioned at the inquest, but the parents had concerns about him with his fascination with knives and different things.
Yeah, and that's where mental health is tricky, because there are so many people with mental health difficulties or mental illness or psychosis or schizophrenia that are never violent. So that is quite important to put into context. But you have to add layers to the mental health that then add to the potential then to be violent. So, the various issues with grievances in life, very, very, very much violent interests or things like that can then be exacerbators for the mental illness. But then we can also have things like depression that can be a catalyst for then developing a grievance and a fixation, and that can then perpetuate and grow from there. So I think mental health can be a causal factor or an indirect factor as well. And sometimes as well, we also say that there's, subclinical things that are not really at the diagnostic threshold, which drive behaviour. It might be that someone really struggles with shame and envy of others and is very likely to get quite jealous, and they've got a personality that makes them prone to collecting grievances or feeling like they've been wronged, and that then walks them down that path to violence.
It's sitting here talking to you, I'm getting an appreciation of how complicated it is. If you see Sarah Yule at the conference, apologise to her. I expected too much from her. There's so many layers and variables, isn't it? So I can see why you try to structure things as best you can. It's not foolproof, but here's some indicators. Might be the way we prevent this.
Yeah, I think we need to be careful that as psychologists we're not always trying to come up with an explanation to overcomplicate it. But loosely I always go, how dialed up are the dials for the person, so how intense are things. Then we can also think about how frequent is the symptoms or the traits, and then what's the severity of it as well. So we need to look at it through frameworks that make it understandable.
Yeah. And a framework makes it as understandable as best you can hope for. Leading into the use of AI, do you see that as something that's going to be very much in the forefront of criminal investigation?
It's hard. I mean, in terms of the mass casualty space, we've already seen over in the US that people have had AI write plans around how to carry out a mass casualty attack for them.
I was thinking from the good guys. You're looking from the bad guys.
Well, looking at from an offender capability
Yeah.
enhancement aspect, and we know that that's happening already.
Yeah.
What it means for police investigations, it's really hard to say. It'll make some of the more boring tasks of writing up things easier, but facial recognition and those sorts of things I think will transform as well. So it's hard to anticipate where it will go.
I'm thinking like ViClass that you talk about, like if you had an AI component assessing all the information, that might make it even more readily available.
I think the ability to analyse mass amounts of data or information will greatly improve, but it will still require, the human analyst to develop the right meaning and interpretation of that.
I'm looking at getting back to, and prevention is the key of hopefully what you're achieving. And I've got a couple of headings here, but fixated threat assessments, fixated persons unit, and need for information sharing. So three main points. So if we're talking about preventing these type of lone actor attacks, breaking down those three headings, like fixated threat assessments, how do they play a part? And I know we've touched on it, but just breaking it down again.
So fixated threat assessments really are police and mental health specialists working together to make decisions about a person of concern. And
Okay.
that starts by information coming in about a person and then doing a screening judgment to look at, okay, do we need to be concerned about this based on the information? Do we need to dig more? We might find that once we dig that it is concerning, then you would go through the process of doing a more rigorous assessment. Then you might look to engage with the person to understand things further. And then if you're still concerned, then it would be going, okay, let's put some wraparound support towards the person. And then you'd monitor, you'd review. And if it's still not improving, that might be then when there's more targeted responses that could emerge.
It's a multi-agency approach then, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's very much, it's not just the police, it's mental health, the health system, all sorts of things.
Yeah, and in this space we've realised that it is multi-agency, that we need to be very careful of silos of information being held and locked down and not being shared. Manharan Monis was probably a good example of that information needs to flow to the right people, and then those reviews and those assessments then need to go back to other people in return. So we can't be locking down on things. We need to be very mindful of gaps in practice where we don't have knowledge, disconnects between agencies as well. And I'd probably also say that a couple of other things around bunkers. So, not just doing an assessment on someone and going, look, they're low concern. We'll just put the paperwork in the file and we're done with that. And 2 weeks later, there's an incident. So we can't necessarily be reassured by the fact that we've done an assessment and go, okay, we can wash our hands of that. And then the last one really is myopia, where we simply lose focus because we're looking at this too much, or we're not getting an outside perspective. So we're too much groupthink or whatever it might be, where it causes us just not to see that this has changed. And probably, I think, in the lone actor space, the myopia aspect is where we may come undone again in the future, because we're seeing more and more young people now presenting with risk factors and concerning behaviours that if someone had said that to you a decade ago, you would have been horrified and you would have hit the panic button. Now that our tolerance for that,
we've become desensitised to it.
Yeah. So, people with very violent ideations and purchasing of weapons and engagement in quite extreme gore and extremist material that are very young, it's become commonplace is not the right word, but in the work that we do, it's a little bit more commonplace now that is the type of person of concern that you're seeing. And the worry then is that we go, okay, well, we're so used to that now, and we've seen so many of them that don't do anything, but we need to be very rigorous and understand that could change and that could escalate quite easily.
I could see people dropping their guard down because we've seen this, and there's 100 people that are like that. Why are we worried about this person? But that could be the one person.
Yes, and I think in Australia as well, we had a good probably wake-up call last year in 2024. So obviously we had the Bondi Junction attack, which was sort of separate in some ways, but then there was the Good Shepherd Church. A couple of weeks later, there was a young 16-year-old over in Western Australia that stabbed someone at Bunnings and then was killed by police. And then about 6 or 7 weeks later, was it Parramatta or Newcastle? I can't remember. A young person with a GoPro tactical vest walked in with a couple of knives into a politician's office, and fortunately they didn't go through with the attack. But within that space of 2 months, there potentially could have been 4 very serious mass casualty attacks.
Young males involved in it too. What is the reason so many young males seem to be the ones that do these things that can be influenced?
Yeah, it is very concerning, and I think there's been a lot spoken about men and masculinity and where are men at the moment. A lot of them are searching for identity and their place in society. And for men, when they're struggling and can't find a way to connect or can't have an intimate relationship or are unsure how to cope with their mental health. They don't know how to communicate. It can take a troubling turn, and there's a lot of work, I think, for men to do and to find pro-social outlets to, express their challenges in the right way, because it's easy to turn to blame and frustration, and also believe that others are responsible for what's happening to you, for your shortcomings and difficulties. So I think there's so much that we need to be doing with men to help them improve how they handle stresses and problems in their life.
Well, I think it's in the nature of men that they internalise too, and not creating an environment where they can express their feelings. And I think most men understand this. If you're going through an issue and your mate says, "How you going?" you say, "Good," and that's that's good, mate. I was worried about you, and then you move on from the conversation.
Yeah.
Where if it's, and this is probably been too harsh, a comparison, and then with females it might be they talk. I can put my hand up. I know my partners know more about my friendships and life than I do. Like they'll go, "Oh, your best mate's just had a baby." Did he? Who told you that? "Oh, Susan told me that," or something like that. So we need to communicate a little bit better, don't we?
Males, unfortunately, they disproportionately make up the statistics for suicide.
Yeah,
and they disproportionately make up the statistics for violent offences.
Yeah, it's not good. With the work that you're doing with New Zealand Police, can you see a down the track where more attention will be given to the type of work that you do? Because quite frankly, listening to you talk about your risk assessments and different things, there is so much work to do. Are we properly... I think policing, and you don't have to comment because you're still employed by police, but I thought we fell behind in the forensic science field in that with DNA and all that, we didn't have the capability of properly examining a crime scene. We didn't properly resource it. With intel, probably not properly resourced. In your field, forensic psychology, do you think police are starting to understand the benefits as a whole?
Well, look, I've got very complimentary things to say about New Zealand Police.
So you're clever. See, that's why you're employed.
Yeah, not because they're my employer, but look, I think New Zealand's running a really good model, which is very positive for bringing expertise in. So they have a fixated threat assessment centre over there as well, but that's purely for politicians, so politicians that are subject to threats and being targeted. But we have our behavioural science unit, which is very much bring specialists in for operational support. So the model over there is really strong, and there's a recognition that for major crimes, the input of experts or specialists is really one of the tools that we need to solving these. Yep. In Australia, unfortunately, it has fallen by the wayside. We had that, but many of the units have closed down.
Fixated persons unit that, in my experience, notoriously under-resourced, but it was something, a need that we just didn't have it. We had intel officers attached to major crime squads and that, but we really needed someone with the expertise for specifically fixated persons and being able to assess them properly. Yeah,
and I think it will come back again, because sometimes, as in policing, it's money and resources that dictate where things go. And look, Victoria, New South Wales, I think Western Australia, they all had specialist operational psychology arms to them. It's only Queensland Police now that still have it that I'm aware of.
How do we go backwards in a progressive field?
Like it shocks me. Because I look over in the UK, they have behavioural investigative advisors over there, so they've got specialists that are recognised, and they've done some great work. Over in Canada, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, they've got a specialist behavioural unit as well that's a mixture of psychologists and psychiatrists providing operational support. FBI have 4 dedicated units towards bringing specialty expertise in. And then you look across all the different US states, they've got specialised threat teams and things. So look, it is the model forward dealing with, challenging and difficult cases in policing.
And UK and Canada, I've worked in both those areas in policing inquiries from New South Wales, and they're set up very similar to what we've got here in Australia. New Zealand's the same, and they're all moving forward with it, and we're moving backwards.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting with New Zealand is it is a small place, but there's one police service for the country.
Yeah.
So it's just one national unit, and obviously Australia has some of the challenges on a smaller scale to the US with the states at the federal level, and when it's one unit one force for a country, then you can be a little bit more
united,
focused with what you're doing. And
look, we're not too bad in this country compared to America. We had someone, I forget who it was, that his first assignment as a police officer, there was 12 people in the police force. This was in America, and he had to buy his own gun. But I remember who it was. It was Steve Murphy from the Netflix Narcos series that took down Pablo Escobar, and that was his first police force. One of the other points, and we talked on fixated persons unit, the fixated threat assessments, need for information sharing. We talked about within organisations, government organisations, law enforcement agencies. But what about the public? What part can the public play in the role of making sure we identify these lone actors?
Yeah, some ways it's the bystander challenges that we have with crime, that people are aware of something happening, but for whatever reason, it might be their own self-doubt, it might be that they minimise it, but they don't always report really valuable information. And ultimately, preventing lone actor attacks or mass casualty events it's about information flowing from members of the community through to police, so that police are then able to look over it, assess it, and make sense of that information. And a lot of policing is about information gathering, and the public are a crucial part of that. So whether it is anything from, unusual activities such as suddenly being interested in firearms or trying to collect knives, and also at the same time they might be saying that they're very angry with someone, or they've got a particular problem with this person or an organisation, all the way through to knowing maybe that your child is viewing some problematic and unhealthy content. So may not be always going to the police, but of course it's important that information is shared with someone. It might be a school counsellor, but sharing the information so that it's not siloed and not pocketed, and allowing some other eyeballs to get across that to make more informed judgments about that. And then if it needs to be escalated and passed on, then hopefully it does get to the police.
Well, we do need to share that, because quite often when you hear of an incident and then, the media have done their bit and everyone's talking about, and that person was always strange. It was strange ever since that he went to kindergarten. And all these people come out and identify with that. That's the type of information that we've got to get across.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's sharing that information. We touched on the media and the copycat type situation, and also about the media giving too high a profile to the people that carry out these crimes. I've thought for a long time, and it's hard because there's an inquiry in mind, people want to find out, and there's a benefit by putting the name out, because if it's someone, man Monis, other people might come forward and say, well, he did this and did that, so you find out more information about it. But you don't want them to be put up there on a pedestal. What way do you think the media should treat someone like what happened in Christchurch?
I think uniform policies would be ideal.
So they're not competing against each other.
Yeah, especially across the Trans-Tasman. I think we could get uniform policies that would be achievable, where we need to make a decision around what we will and won't publish. Now, New Zealand made a really interesting decision to not publish Tarrant's name. He is and will be forever known as the terrorist. So he wasn't named in New Zealand. Obviously, it's very different within Australia. But that certainly, I think, took the sting out of it and the power of his actions in that he didn't receive the notoriety, and it was very much victim lens focus. And that is important. The narratives and the survival stories of victims it's probably what we want to come out of these attacks rather than it being about the perpetrator. Now, that's tricky because talking about the perpetrator does, as you say, serve some purposes where there's an understanding that we do need, and it generates more information, but we don't want to sensationalise that. And that's a tricky point, but I think if we make it heavily victim-focused with basic details about the person rather than writing at length about their motivations or their ideology, then that's a nice balance point.
Okay. We might finish up here. I reckon we could talk all day. You're a wealth of knowledge, and you've taken me back into a world that make me appreciate how complicated it is what you're doing. You're over here in Australia. You're talking at some conferences.
Yes, I'm at the New South Wales Correction Conference, which is on, and also we're also running a stalking symposium with a host of guests in Melbourne as well.
Right. You work with corrective services. I haven't really touched on that, but what can you learn from people in prison?
Oh, an enormous amount. I mean, we have individuals that are there for lengthy stints in custody, and there's always the temptation to go, let's just lock them up, forget about them, and not go and talk to them. And by talking to them and engaging with them, first of all, we gain a rich amount of insight from their stories and their motivations and their reasons and their pathways to carrying out their act of violence. We then can improve our responses by learning about that. Now, the other side, of course, is rehabilitating them as well. Do we want to put the time and resources into them? And I think it's somewhat negligent if we don't go through the process of at least trying, and certainly in the lone actors space, we've seen where some things have gone wrong for various reasons, that people have been held on remand for long periods and they haven't had treatment, and then they've come out and they've committed a mass attack. So that's a whole different landscape, but probably my key takeaway is that we shouldn't just lock people up and forget that they're there. There's a lot of value for various reasons to engage with them. No,
it makes sense. Can we de-radicalise people? Like young people that it doesn't have to be age based, but can you de-radicalise someone with the proper work, do you think?
De-radicalisation's an interesting one. It's topical and controversial. The UK has probably had the most challenging implications of that. So there was big efforts to de-radicalise people in the UK, and a lot of the de-radicalisation programs emerged from there, and they've made their way over to Australia and New Zealand. And we've kind of learnt that de-radicalisation programs don't work.
Right.
But part of that is they were brought out during a time when it was all Islamic-inspired violence or jihadi-inspired violence. A couple of years later, it had evolved, and then it was right-wing violence, and then it was grievance-based violence. So the fundamentals of a lot of the de-radicalisation process assume that it was just ideology that was causing violence, when actually maybe ideology was only the top layer of the problem, and it didn't get to the core reasons that the person was becoming violent. So I think we need to take a few steps back and ask the questions of really around, why was violence a solution for this person? How did they start on the pathway to violence? So try and get to some of the core things rather than going, okay, they just need to de-radicalise and change these unhealthy and problematic beliefs.
Well, you haven't disappointed me, because like every psychologist I speak to, there's always an if or but or maybe. But that's I bring it back to Sarah. She would always, that might be the case, but it could be this. And can you give me a yes or no? No, I can't give you a yes or no. But I like the way your mind thinks and the work you're doing, and I think it's important work. And I thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to come into the studio and talk to us today. And I thoroughly recommend your book, Mass Casualty: The Rise of Lone Actors. So interesting read. Where can people get it if they want it?
So it's available obviously on Amazon and online bookstores. It'll be Barnes and Noble overseas and shortly in bookstores here, and also on the publisher's website, groundproofforensics.com.
Very good. If people want to get in contact with you, and you don't have to answer this because you might get inundated, but if people wanted to reach out to you, how could they reach out to you?
So I do private consulting work, so drnathanbrooks.com as well.
Okay. Thanks very much for coming on. I've enjoyed the chat.
Thanks for having me, Gary.
Cheers.